So the civil rights movements of the 1950s is what we're focusing on mostly today. But of course we've all got to revise and look at the things you did in year 12 earlier on this year and see the bigger picture. And on Friday we're going to do a lot of evaluation of all the things that we've looked at today and a few things that we'll look at in a bit more detail on Friday. But there's 4 things to take note of today. The first one is Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka, which I believe is in Alabama, 1954, a landmark ruling in civil rights, because the Supreme Court, although in the past had ruled that separate but equal was fine, in this case they said, in the case of education, there was no place for separate but equal. And the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, they had instigated this lawsuit, and that's one of the things the NAACP was very good at. It was an intellectual branch of the civil rights movement, and so bringing in lawsuits was one of their things, and then they won, partly because the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, was very sympathetic to the civil rights movement, but also because it was really easy to prove that separate but equal was not happening. For example, in Texas, this is not exact, but something along the lines of the University of Texas had like 3 libraries. The equivalent for training African American lawyers in Texas that had no library at all. So it's not separate but equal, is it? But you see that some of the states in the South kicked back against this, and what actually happened is they tried to get around the ruling, and they were determined to maintain segregation. So, for example, some states, or some parts of states, some counties, closed all their schools and gave grants to private schools for them to take the white kids. So that the public schools just completely shut for a number of years, in some cases, years. And so that although this ruling was a landmark ruling, the impact wasn't always immediate. And so even by 1964, 10 years later, only 2% of African Americans in the 11 southern states went to integrated schools. So the southern states kicked back against this. Little Rock High School, which you'll also read about today, is an example of this, because the people of Little Rock High School, the white community, did not want black people to come to their school, but had been ordered that the school had to be desegregated. So when the black children came to the school, they were subject to huge amounts of abuse from what were to be their classmates. And the governor of Arkansas tried to use the National Guard to stop 9 students from entering the school. However, the federal government stepped in, and President Eisenhower, sent federal troops and announced that he was taking control of the 10,000 men of the Arkansas National Guard, and the soldiers of the National Guard, who had been informed by the governor of Arkansas to block the black students from getting into the school. Well, now their job was to walk the children to school, walk the African American children to school, which they would do for another year. So the federal government enforced a ruling by the Supreme Court on the southern states, which is quite another landmark, and they link together. I hope you can see how. Now, also in the southern states, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, who you may have heard of, she's quite famous in history, decided that she'd had enough of segregation on public transport. So she decided, I'm not getting up. A white person wants my seat, I'm staying in my seat. And as a result of that, the driver called the police, she was arrested, and it led to the Montgomery Bus boycott. African Americans often used public transport because they were the more poorer people in society, often because of the discrimination largely, and the African Americans and any white supporters of the movement decided we're not going to use those buses, so the buses went empty, and this strike lasted around about a year. And the black people were organised together. They got a lot of support because obviously this little, she wasn't quite an old lady, but she was quite an innocent lady, good moral character, and it was just obviously blatantly ridiculous. So going around the world was all of this information. At the time of the Cold War, and America's trying to portray itself as the leader of the free world, it was really embarrassing that they were arresting this lady for sitting on a seat in a bus and not getting up because a white person wanted to sit down. So that was really important because it gave a lot of publicity to the civil rights case, and actually in the end there was another court case in which it was ruled unconstitutional to segregate on the buses, and so that stopped that. By the end of 1956, it had a big impact on the buses, but also in the civil rights movement in general. And as a result of the Montgomery Bus boycott, well, one of the key organisers of that boycott, who organised for African Americans to do carpools so that they could still get to work and protest against the bus company, well, that man you've probably heard of, Martin Luther King. He emerged as a leader of the civil rights movement, and he was going to have a huge impact in the 60s. He united both the intellectual African Americans, which the NAACP had got on well with, but also the less educated black community, which the NAACP had not quite managed to connect with. Martin Luther was such a brilliant speaker that he could connect all areas of African American society and white people too, and convince them that what was going on in America was wrong. So there's 4 key elements of civil rights in the 1950s.